They called him useless, a burden not worth saving. But as the auctioneer's hammer rose for the final time, a stranger's hand cut through the silence, one quiet gesture that would unravel years of hidden cruelty. Why did this scarred man risk everything for a dying dog, and what secret did that dog carry in his haunted eyes? Stay until the end. Some stories don't just break your heart, they reveal truths we're too afraid to face. Echo Ridge lay buried in the quiet heart of northern Wyoming, a town wrapped in wind and whispers. Winter had not yet arrived in full, but the air had the kind of bite that made your lungs tighten when you breathed in too deep. Frost clung to the edges of weathered barn roofs, and the trees lining the road into town stood bare skeletal waiting. At the edge of town near the stockyard where the hills turned to dust, the annual livestock auction was winding down under a pale, reluctant sun. The crowd had thinned. The heavy hitters had taken their bulls and mares and disappeared in a cloud of pickup dust and muttered deals. Only a handful of townsfolk remained, most of them loitering for the last scraps of gossip or out of habit. The auctioneer, a wide-shouldered man named Roy Melvin, with calloused hands and a permanent squint from decades staring into wind, was growing hoarse from hours of calls. A side gate creaked open with a reluctant groan, and through it limped a shadow of a dog. The German Shepherd was large, or had been once. Now he was sunken in the flanks, his ribs showing through a mottled, dirt-streaked coat. His fur bore the weight of too many seasons spent without shelter, faded matted, tinged with red clay and old scars. His left hind leg dragged behind him uselessly, toes scraping the ground. A faint ring of darkened skin around his neck marked where a chain had once rubbed the fur raw. He didn't bark, didn't growl. Just looked straight ahead, eyes the color of burnt amber. Dull, unreadable, but flickering faintly, as though some ember still burned there. There was a moment of uncertain quiet, and then someone in the back muttered, "Poor thing's done for." Another voice sharper followed. "Not worth the feed. Bet he bit someone." Roy hesitated, then cleared his throat and raised his gavel. "Lot 48. Male estimated 5 years. No papers. Injured." Starting at no bids, he trailed off, scanning the disinterested crowd. The silence wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was indifferent. And then, from the very back of the barn, a hand rose. It didn't wave or gesture loudly. It simply rose calm and deliberate, as if it had been waiting all day for this exact moment. Heads turned. Caleb Morgan stood there partially shrouded by the wooden beam of the entranceway. He was tall and rangy, his frame wiry from years of hard labor and war. His hair was streaked with ash gray, not from age, so much as experience, and tucked beneath a faded brown beanie. He wore an old army surplus jacket, with one sleeve slightly more faded than the other, and scuffed boots crusted with the red dust of Windmere Hill. A jagged scar split his chin down to his jawline, the kind that told stories he never repeated. His eyes, a stormy slate blue, rarely settled on people for long, but now they were fixed squarely on the dog. Caleb had been back in Echo Ridge for nearly a decade after leaving the military, but few truly knew him. They knew of him, the man who lived alone at the end of Windmere Road, who didn't come into town unless he had to, who never raised his voice and never raised his hand. They whispered about how he lost his son Micah in Afghanistan and how his wife had left not long after. Since then, the house on the hill had grown quiet, the garden overrun the porch, slouched with age. But Caleb endured like the wind and the pine. "Sold," Roy said, more confused than convinced, dropping the gavel with a soft clunk. There was no applause, no congratulations, just a faint murmur and the shuffle of boots on straw. Caleb didn't hesitate. He walked the length of the barn, boots echoing like memory, and knelt beside the dog. The German Shepherd lifted his head weakly, and for a moment they looked at each other. Not like man and animal, but like two veterans passing in the hallway of a forgotten battle. Caleb reached out, not to leash, not to restrain, but simply to place a hand on the dog's shoulder. The dog didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He leaned in. Just slightly. Just enough to tell the truth he was still alive. Caleb murmured something too soft for anyone to hear, then slipped his arm under the dog's chest, the other beneath his hindquarters, and lifted him gently. For a man of his build, the effort must have strained him, but his expression didn't change. Only his eyes did. Something old had flickered awake. Outside, the wind whistled down from Windmere Ridge. The sky had darkened with approaching dusk, and a few snow flurries had begun to drift lazily from above. Caleb moved with steady pace toward his old Dodge pickup, its green paint chipped and rusted at the edges. He opened the back, lined with old blankets and hay, and laid the dog down as though handling something sacred. He looked down one last time, then said, "You're coming home with me now, Rook." The name hung in the air like it had always been his, and the dog closed his eyes.
The morning sun spilled through the slatted windows of Ben Holloway's cabin, casting long streaks of gold across the wooden floor. Outside, the sea was calm again, the tide gently kissing the shoreline in a rhythmic hush. Inside, the air still smelled of ash from the night fire, and something else, wet fur salt and faint antiseptic from the first aid kit Ben had rummaged through at dawn. The two dogs lay curled near the hearth, wrapped in soft towels, their breathing now deeper and more, even though their bodies still trembled at times in their sleep. Ben, still in the same clothes as the night before, sat on the edge of the old armchair, arms resting on his knees, watching. He had seen broken things before. Boats cracked open by storms, engines melted by fire, and once in a different life, men shattered by grief. But this, whatever these dogs had endured, felt different. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was as though something had been wiped clean from them, or maybe hidden beneath layers of instinct. He reached for his phone, the screen cracked at one corner, and pulled up an old contact. Her name was Dr. Cora Sullivan. They hadn't spoken in years, not since before he left the Navy. But if anyone could make sense of what he was seeing, it was her. Cora was a veterinarian in the coastal town of Blue Haven, a place of weathered docks and seafood joints that smelled of fryer oil and tide. She was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, with the kind of posture that suggested she had once been rigidly trained to stand at attention. Her dark brown hair was always pulled into a messy knot, and she had the habit of squinting slightly when focusing, as if trying to see through people, not just at them. Cora had once worked on a classified military project involving canine intelligence before she pivoted to private practice after the death of her dog Coda during a maritime recovery exercise gone wrong. The incident had reshaped her, made her quieter, more guarded, but no less brilliant. When Ben called, she answered on the third ring. Ben Holloway. She said, her voice surprised, but not unfriendly. "You're not dead, then?" "Not yet," he replied with a dry chuckle. "Listen, I've got something strange out here. 2 German Shepherd pups. Found them adrift about 10 miles offshore yesterday." There was a pause. "Alive barely. I've got them here now. They're stable, but they're not ordinary." He could almost hear her straighten up on the other end. "What do you mean?" Ben told her about the callers, their behavior, the way they didn't bark or whine, and how they responded to environmental sounds as if cataloging them. Cora didn't hesitate. "I'll be there by noon." She arrived 2 hours later, stepping out of a dusty silver SUV with a rolling medical kit slung over one shoulder. Her long trench coat fluttered behind her as she walked down the dock, boots thudding softly against the wood. She looked tired, eyes shadowed skin, pale beneath the early sun, but moved with precise confidence. Inside the cabin, Cora dropped to a crouch beside the dogs without a word. She moved carefully, hands firm but gentle, checking their limbs, ears and eyes. Ben watched her study them, with the kind of intensity reserved for live minds or half-told truths. Hydration's low, but not critical. Minor abrasions on the pads. "This one's got bruising along the ribs," she murmured, gesturing to the darker-furred pup, Riley. "No broken bones. Muscle tones strong. This isn't their first time surviving something." She lifted the old collar around Remy's neck. "This is military weave. Same pattern I saw used in Faye's Echo. Doesn't belong on any household pet." She unbuckled it carefully and ran her fingers along the inner lining, her brow furrowed. "Wait." She retrieved a small scanning wand from her kit and hovered it over the inner seam. A faint beep. "There's a chip here, not implanted under the skin, hidden inside the collar." Ben leaned in. Tracker Cora shook her head. "Not this kind. It's a data capsule. I've only seen these used in prototype deployments meant to record environmental data and command inputs. No GPS, no transmission. pure memory storage. Like a black box, Ben asked. Exactly. She said, her voice taut with concern. Whatever program these dogs came from, it wasn't public. She sat back on her heels, expression unreadable, and they were just out there, alone. Ben nodded. No boats, no debris, just them. A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace and the soft rhythm of the ocean outside. Do you remember what happened to Coda? Cora asked suddenly, her eyes not leaving the dogs. Ben hesitated. He died during the Neptune recovery drill. That's what they said. They lied, she whispered. I didn't know it then. But months later, I found reports, coded logs, saying the dogs in that program were being used for more than search and rescue. They were testing response to electromagnetic pulses, acoustic command overrides, even psychological stress simulation. Coda didn't die in a training accident. He broke down. They let him drown. Ben felt his jaw tighten. And these two, I'd bet they were from the same expansion program, possibly second-generation Echo assets. Phase Beta. She looked at the pups again. Riley shifted slightly in his sleep, his paw twitching. Remy opened one eye, studied her silently, then lowered his head again. Do they have names, she asked. Not yet, Ben said. But they're here now. She nodded slowly. Then let's keep them safe. Whatever they escaped from might not be done looking for them. As she began to pack up, Ben stepped outside the wind, tugging lightly at his shirt. In the distance, he thought he heard the low rumble of a helicopter far off and fading. He narrowed his eyes toward the horizon. Inside, Riley stirred, his ears pricking up. Then slowly, cautiously, he rose to his feet, stiff but steady. His eyes scanned the cabin, not fearful, watchful. Something in him remembered. Something that never left. The sky above Mossy Key had turned a pale gray by early afternoon, with thin streaks of cloud drawing lazy lines toward the horizon. The breeze from the ocean had picked up slightly enough to rattle the wind chimes on Ben's front porch and send the smell of brine through every crack of the cabin walls. Inside, the air was tense, not loud or frantic, but heavy with the quiet hum of possibilities neither Ben nor Cora could yet explain. Riley lay curled by the fireplace again, though this time with one eye open, tracking movement, registering sounds. His coat was still damp near the base of the neck, where Cora had carefully sliced into the collar lining earlier that morning. The chip she had extracted now rested on the table, no larger than a fingernail, glinting faintly under the cabin's overhead light. Remy lay nearby, head resting on his paws, breathing evenly. Though younger and lighter in frame than Riley, Remy displayed the same signs: heightened awareness, calculated stillness, and a strange reluctance to fully relax. Cora stood hunched over her portable diagnostic tablet, connecting a cable to the chip's base housing with practiced precision. She wore a thick green utility jacket with several medical patches on the sleeves and faint grease stains across the shoulders, a legacy of long days in the field. Her hair, tied in a taut bun, showed a streak of premature gray near the temple, and her jaw clenched unconsciously as she worked. On her right wrist, a thin bracelet made of braided nylon, a piece of her late dog, Coda's old collar, remained a permanent fixture barely visible under her sleeve. Ben hovered near the doorway, arms crossed, his gaze shifting between the dogs and the device. His nerves weren't from fear, but from a lifetime of having learned to expect betrayal from silence. The former engineer in him itched to understand the mechanisms, but it was the man beneath the surface, the one marked by losses the Navy never officially recorded, that kept his distance. This thing isn't encrypted in any modern format, Cora muttered. It's using a military-grade memory format, low-power, loop-encoded, similar to drone firmware, but layered in command trees. Not the kind of thing you'd find in a household pet, or even in standard K9 units. The screen began to flicker. Lines of static gave way to partial strings of text-fragmented metadata stitched together by the processor. Asset, Echo 2B breed. Canis lupus familiaris, German Shepherd, juvenile dual unit, pair program, Neptune, Echo Tier 2, operational zone, marine recon, coastal surveillance status. Decommissioned data retention mode. Active. Cora leaned closer. It's logging everything. Environmental scans, audio tags, even stress response data. Ben frowned. What about GPS no signal history? Which makes sense. This wasn't meant to be tracked remotely. It was designed to store, respond, and adapt locally. These dogs, they're self-contained systems, behavior feedback loops, emotion responsive command integration. They're not just trained, they're designed to learn autonomously through stress exposure. You're telling me they think like people? I'm saying they are being asked to, she replied, voice tight. This kind of structure isn't just obedience. It's conditional learning, contextual recall, strategic reaction. As she spoke, a soft knock came from the cabin's rear door. Both dogs rose at once. Riley stood first, his ears perked forward, body low, but ready. Remy followed slower, tense. Ben reached for the drawer near the counter and pulled out an old utility knife, tucking it behind his back as he moved to the side window. Through the blur of glass and salt-streaked wood, he saw a tall man with a long brown coat and a crate tucked under one arm. His hair was silver blonde, almost white, and cut short at the sides. Despite the wind, he stood perfectly still. His expression was unreadable, though his posture lacked threat. Ben opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" "Name's Quentin Hayes," the man said with a calm southern drawl. "I own the general store on the mainland. Cora left some supplies last month, figured I'd run 'em over since I was making a trip to fix the lighthouse relay." Ben looked him over. Quentin was around 50, clean-shaven, medium build, with the leathery skin of someone who worked outdoors for a living. His eyes, a pale gray-green, watched everything like a bird of prey, not aggressive, but calculating. He was a minor character in Ben's world, seen only twice before, but always with quiet, efficient presence. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. "Put it on the porch," Ben said. "Appreciate the delivery." Quentin nodded, but his eyes shifted briefly toward the dogs now standing behind Ben. His gaze lingered just a little too long before he turned away. "Those yours?" he asked. Ben hesitated. "They are now. No tags." Quentin noted, placing the crate down gently. "But they sure stand like they know what they're doing." Ben didn't respond. Quentin straightened. "Storm might roll in tomorrow. You two watch yourselves." With that, he tipped his head, returned to his small skiff at the dock, and motored away. Back inside, Cora tapped through the final data layer. A file titled Protocol Failsafe 7 refused to open. "Looks like a self-locking trigger. My access isn't enough." "What happens if it activates?" Ben asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "But if this program was decommissioned, the failsafe might be lethal. Or it could trigger an alert." Ben's voice dropped low. "Then we make sure it never activates." At the fireplace, Riley's head turned sharply toward the window. A distant thump echoed through the cabin, indistinct but heavy. Remy followed, tail stiffening. Cora stood slowly. Whatever they were part of, someone might already be looking for them. That chip may have been silent, but it's not forgotten. Ben nodded once, silently agreeing. Outside, the wind had changed direction. The wind picked up overnight. By morning, a fine mist had settled along the coastline, wrapping Mossy Key in a damp, whispering veil. The air tasted like iron, thick with storm anticipation, and something quieter, more sinister. Inside the cabin, Ben Holloway stood by the front window, eyes narrowed at the shoreline, just beyond his dock. There, in the soft sand barely visible unless one knew where to look, were 3 distinct impressions bootprints. Large, recent. He didn't panic. Panic was for people who hadn't lived through pressure cookers and storm cells, people who didn't know what it felt like to wake in the middle of the night to the sound of a hull breach. But he did reach for his utility knife and slide it into his belt. He stepped onto the porch barefoot, quietly tracking the prints. They stopped about a foot from the stern rope of his skiff, the same one he'd tied down yesterday evening. The knot was still firm, but something about it felt touched, tested. Inside, Cora Sullivan was still asleep, curled awkwardly in the old leather armchair, with her tablet on her lap and her jacket thrown across her shoulders. Her brows were furrowed even in rest, the kind of tension people carried after years of seeing good things used for bad purposes. In her hands rested the diagnostic slate containing the encrypted data block from the chip, the one file that still refused to open. Riley and Remy were both awake. They didn't bark, didn't whimper, but they were alert ears, pricked eyes steady. Riley sat at the base of the fireplace like a statue, gaze fixed on the door even before Ben opened it. Remy stayed near the back of the room, tail stiff, muscles tense, Something in the air had changed, and they felt it before any of the humans did. Ben stepped back inside, brushing rain off his shoulders. Someone was here, he said quietly. Cora blinked the sleep from her eyes. Here. As in on the island. Ben nodded. Footprints, 3 sets, heavy boots. No sign of a boat, but tides would have cleared one easy if they came in late. He paused. And the skiff's mooring knot was tampered with. Cora sat up straighter. They're watching the data, or worse, they're tracking anomalies. The chip might not transmit, but something triggered attention when you access the failsafe. She rubbed her face. Protocol failsafe. 7. It's a ghost in the file system. It might have a passive trigger, or a delayed ping designed to notify the server if tampering's detected. Ben paced toward the table. You said this program Neptune Echo was decommissioned 3 years ago. Cora's eyes darkened. Yes. But programs like that don't die. They just go off record. In an industrial building nearly 200 miles inland buried in the forests of Virginia, the signal from the failsafe did not go unnoticed. A private military contractor named Archway Directive, known to very few in official channels, still maintains secure facilities and archive protocols from closed operations. There, in a windowless command room lit by soft blue backlight, a man stood before a screen pulsing with red. He was tall and lean, with dark eyes set into a sharply chiseled face. His name was Victor Sorrell, and he wore no insignia, just a tailored black tactical coat and a lanyard with an ID card that didn't list his department. Victor was known inside Archway for his cold logic and surgical command style. No raised voices, no sudden movements, just control. Where's the origin ping? He asked, voice smooth. A technician, young, pale, jittery, swallowed and replied, Eastern Coast, small island, cross-checking now. Looks like Mossy Key. Victor nodded. Assets Echo 2B were presumed drowned in failed extraction. This confirms otherwise. What are your orders? Sir Victor turned away from the screen. Send a recon team. Silent approach. Retrieve or erase. No public footprints. Back on the island, unaware of how quickly the window was closing, Ben and Cora debated their next steps. We can't just leave, Cora argued. Not yet. If we move too early, we could walk them straight to wherever we go next. Ben tapped his fingers on the chip table. Then we stay. One more night. But we prepare. Cora nodded reluctantly. I want to get a second opinion on that chip. I know someone, a cryptographer who used to audit code for defense contracts. Lives up near Norfolk. Ben raised an eyebrow. Trusted? Mostly, she said. Her name's Sarah Lang, early 40s, sharp. Keeps a low profile after whistleblowing on a drone testing unit. She's tall, always dressed like she's about to crawl through ductwork and can make any system bleed with 2 hours and a bottle of cheap bourbon. Sounds like your kind of people. Exhausting, Cora replied. But yes. That evening, Ben set up motion-triggered lights along the property perimeter. They weren't military grade, but they were enough to show movement through brush. He also placed old wind chimes made of scrap metal at irregular intervals around the trail that led down to the dock. The breeze might set them off, sure, but that wasn't the point. The point was unpredictability, movement against pattern, a language he understood well. Meanwhile, Riley and Remy kept watch from opposite ends of the cabin. Remy had begun sniffing the same patch near the window, repeatedly, then sat down and didn't move for hours. Riley, on the other hand, began pacing slowly along the door frames and walls as if tracing boundaries, calculating exits. When Ben handed him an old tennis ball out of habit, the dog didn't chase it. He only pressed his nose against it and then gently placed it by the door like an offering. That night, the storm finally came. Not a violent one, but a slow creeping drizzle that hissed against the windows and softened every sound. Ben didn't sleep. Neither did Cora. The dogs didn't close their eyes once. And just after 2 a.m., one of the chimes clinked not in the rhythm of the wind, but in a deliberate burst of movement. Ben's hand moved silently to the shotgun hidden beneath the floorboard. Cora glanced at her tablet still connected to the chip. A small alert blinked on screen. System integrity error, external access detected. Something or someone had tried to breach the encrypted data again. The road off Mossy Key was a thin, uneven ribbon of gravel barely wider than a single vehicle. The rain had passed by morning, leaving everything slick and shining under the soft wash of daylight. The old pickup truck Ben drove creaked with every bump and leaned slightly to the left, a relic from another life now reborn as their escape pod. Cora Sullivan sat in the passenger seat, arms folded tightly, her eyes fixed on the wet horizon. She wore a dark forest green tactical jacket zipped halfway up, revealing a black turtleneck underneath. Her face, framed by windswept strands of hair escaping her ponytail, held a faraway look, like she was trying to see something that wasn't out there, something that lived only in the past. In the covered truck bed behind them, Riley and Remy lay side by side, wrapped in dry canvas. Riley's head poked just above the flap eyes, scanning the tree line that lined the rural access road. Remy remained lower, quiet, but alert, ears twitching at every passing crow, every shift in the wind. They had left before dawn. Ben had packed lightly tools, field rations, spare fuel, and 2 hunting knives. They were headed toward Blue Haven, a port town about 4 hours southeast, where Cora's contact Sarah Lang was waiting. But the drive was longer than its distance. The silence stretched. After nearly an hour, Ben broke it. "You've been quiet," he said without looking. Cora glanced at him, her jaw tightening for a moment before she sighed. "You asked me once what happened to Coda." Ben didn't respond. He knew the story had been living behind her eyes this whole time, waiting. "He was a prototype," she began. "Part of the first closed field unit for Neptune Echo. I was part of the behavioral coding team. We designed not just obedience modules, but adaptive recall based on trauma response training. Sounds horrible when you say it like that." Because it was. Her voice was steady but low. Coda was smarter than most of us. He could recognize over 300 voice cues and anticipate procedural patterns under duress. I trained him myself, lived with him. He wasn't just a subject. He was my responsibility. Ben kept his eyes on the road, the hum of the tires absorbing the silence between her words. They took him on an offshore operation, simulated extraction under duress, they called it. The ocean low-light helicopter approach, stress conditions at max. Something went wrong with the override system. Coda froze in the water. He didn't respond. Instead of pulling him, they cut the signal, declared the test a loss, and left. She exhaled slowly, her voice shaking for the first time. I didn't find out for days. When I confronted the lead, he told me, "You don't grieve for gear." That was the last day I wore the uniform. Ben turned toward her briefly. "I'm sorry." "I'm not," she replied after a pause. "Because if I hadn't left, I wouldn't have recognized the collars on Riley and Remy." She reached down and pulled a faded patch from the inside pocket of her jacket. The edges were frayed, almost disintegrated, but still visible, a half circle with 4 stars embroidered around the word Echo. They made these for the dog's harnesses in Phase 1. I helped design them. Riley's collar, his weave pattern, the thread, count the chemical resistance, it matches the exact blueprint I signed off on 2 years ago. He and Remy, they're not just from the same program, they're the final evolution. Tier 2 prototypes, fully cognitive dual-pair design. Ben raised a brow. "So, they were meant to work in tandem." "Exactly," she said, linked reflexively. Emotional codependence to amplify survival. If one falls behind, the other compensates. If one resists, the other persuades. We were trying to create dogs who could adapt faster than our command centers. But we never asked if they should. Behind them, Riley shifted, placing his head atop Remy's back. A slow blink, soft breath, but eyes still scanning the trees. Cora looked back. They were designed to survive abandonment. That's the final command set in Tier 2. Ben's voice darkened. "That's not a survival skill. That's a wound you teach someone to carry." They drove on. The roads grew wider as they neared Blue Haven, traffic emerging slowly. Farm trucks, salt-stained sedans, and the occasional motorcyclist in a reflective vest. The town itself emerged from fog like a faded photograph. Brick storefronts, weather-worn signs, and an old clock tower that had long stopped keeping time. Sarah Lang's place was located just off the main square in a converted auto garage. The sign above the door had once said Lang and Sons, but someone had scratched out "in Sons" and spray-painted data salvage beneath it. Sarah herself answered the door with a soldering gun in one hand and a half-bitten donut in the other. She was in her early 40s, tall and narrow, with wire-rimmed glasses perched crookedly on her nose and short black hair tucked under a faded Red Sox cap. Her oversized denim jacket was covered in safety pins, wires, and one patch that read, "I void warranties," in block letters. "You're late," she said flatly, then took another bite of the donut. "Come in. No dogs on the workbench." And don't touch anything that hums unless you want to meet God through a capacitor. Ben raised an eyebrow. Charming. She grows on you, Cora muttered as they stepped inside. The shop was a labyrinth of cables, half-assembled server towers, open laptops, and coffee cups with cryptic warnings like property of NSA. Not really. It smelled of solar machine oil and a hint of lavender air freshener. Sarah took one look at the chip and whistled. Oh, sweetheart. Where have you been hiding? She plugged it into a proprietary reader shaped like a shark fin and began scanning. Encrypted 4 layers deep, command tree logic, no timestamp, metadata. Someone didn't want this to exist in real time. As she worked, Ben wandered toward the door, watching the street. He noticed a sedan parked too far from the curb windows, tinted darker than standard. It hadn't been there when they pulled in. Back inside, Sarah spoke again. This failsafe file. It's not just a shutdown code, it's a burn protocol. Once opened, it wipes all higher access layers and emits a low-frequency audio burst. You don't just lose the data, you signal whoever's listening. Ben turned back toward her. Can you break it without triggering the signal? Sarah cracked her knuckles. Give me 6 hours and a pizza. The old veterinary clinic sat behind a line of wind-bent cypress trees on the southern edge of Blue Haven. Its wooden siding was faded seafoam green, and a brass bell above the door jingled softly when pushed. Though it had closed officially 3 years earlier, after the former owner passed away, Cora Sullivan still held keys to the building, one of the quiet privileges offered to those who had once saved the mayor's dog from a broken pipe emergency. They arrived late morning. Sarah Lang insisted on staying back at her data lab, with the chip muttering about burn layers and Russian failsafe logic, while Ben, Cora, and the dogs drove to the clinic to test a backup decoding tool stored in an off-grid diagnostic terminal Cora had installed years ago. The weather had turned cold again, with thick clouds rolling in from the water, and Blue Haven's narrow streets had emptied under threat of rain. Inside the clinic, the air was cool and dry, tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic and old cedar cabinets. Dust drifted in the beams of overhead light. The power still worked, humming softly through the aged wiring, and Cora's console in the back room booted up with a reassuring tone. Riley and Remy immediately began to explore the space. Riley walking slowly, sniffing corners and checking doorways with the caution of a soldier entering unknown terrain. Remy lighter, in step quicker to move between rooms, but always circling back to Riley's line of sight. As Cora connected the portable copy of the chip's contents to the terminal, Ben stood watch at the front of the building. He glanced through the slatted blinds, tapping the edge of his boot against the floor. There was something about the quiet that didn't sit right, too uniform, too arranged. He had felt it before in foreign harbors, just minutes before sirens wailed and operations turned red. Anything he asked. Cora sat at the console, her fingers flying across the keyboard, decrypting portions of the failsafe clone now. Sarah was right. It's not just a file, it's an access door, and someone designed it to be opened only once. She paused. There's something here. Command branches labeled in serial codes, initiate absentia condition 0, and one marked annulus. That last one is tied to a biometric signature. Ben frowned. Human or canine, I can't tell yet, she said. But the names aren't protocols, they're intentions. Just then, Riley stopped mid-step, his ears twitching sharply to the left. His posture stiffened. Remy caught it too, and quickly repositioned behind a file cabinet. Ben moved fast, silently reaching into his jacket and pulling the collapsible baton he kept for emergencies. The front bell chimed. A man stepped inside. Medium-build leather jacket, buzz-cut, late 30s. Behind him, 2 others followed, taller one, with a backpack slung low, the other carrying what looked like a maintenance clipboard. They didn't speak. They didn't look like patients, and their eyes swept the room with a rhythm that was too smooth to be innocent. Cora stood tense, her hand inching toward the emergency drawer under the counter. We're closed. The man with the buzz cut gave a tight smile. This won't take long. Ben moved between him and Cora. You lost? No, the man replied. But something of ours is. From behind the counter, Riley moved into view, standing at Ben's flank. His body was calm, tail still, but the tension in his stance was undeniable. Remy crept closer through the side hallway, ready but low. The man's expression shifted as he noticed the dogs. There they are. Beautiful work. He nodded to the man with the backpack. That one moved, reaching inside. Ben didn't wait. He lunged forward, striking the arm with the baton. The clipboard clattered to the floor, metal-lined. A concealed taser rolled out. Remy darted forward and leapt, slamming into the third man's legs with controlled force. The man stumbled backward into a shelf, knocking down a tray of instruments. Riley surged ahead, like a trained missile, intercepting the leader before he could draw a second weapon from inside his coat. The room erupted in chaos, papers, flying drawers flung open, the dull thuds of impact mixed with growls and shouts. Cora ducked behind the console and yanked open a secure drawer, pulling out a flare gun and an old comm beacon she had stored there for emergencies. She pressed her thumb against the beacon's biometric pad, input a code, and spoke sharply into the mic. "This is Dr. Cora Sullivan, Blue Haven code sequence 4HUT2C XIOM. Hostile incursion confirmed. Asset recovery protocol activated. Repeating asset recovery protocol activated." Back in the room, Riley had driven the lead man to the floor. He pinned him by the chest, unmoving teeth, bared inches from his neck, but not biting. His restraint was surgical, trained, controlled. The man beneath him froze, wide-eyed. Remy barked sharply, once circling the fallen backpack. Ben pulled it open. Inside were gloves, syringes, and zip ties. Cora emerged slowly, flare gun ready but not raised. The third man, clutching his ribs, crawled toward the door, but hesitated when he saw the beacon flashing red. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Not local police, but something federal, distant but moving fast. The attackers exchanged a glance. The leader spoke through gritted teeth. "You have no idea what those things are." Cora stepped forward. "I know exactly what they are, and I know what you were trying to do." He sneered. "It's not over." "No," Ben said, stepping in. "It's just begun." The three men backed out under Riley and Remy's unyielding watch. Once they were gone, Cora locked the door and collapsed into the chair, the comm beacon still pulsing red. Ben checked both dogs. Remy had a cut above his shoulder, shallow but bleeding. Riley stood beside him, inspecting the wound with a gentle sniff. No panic, no frenzy, just presence. "They were trained for this," Ben murmured. "Yes," Cora said, "but they chose it." She opened the emergency kit and treated Remy's wound as gently as possible. He winced, but stayed still, licking her wrist once as she cleaned the cut. The screen on the console blinked again. A new segment of the decrypted data had opened. Ben read it aloud. "Subject line annulus, Tier 2. Termination protocol. Execute only if containment breach detected. Final command authorization embedded in external biometric host." Cora's blood ran cold. External biometric host. That's not the dogs. Ben nodded grimly. "It's us." The tide was low, and the wind over Blue Haven Harbor carried the tang of rusted chains and diesel fumes. At the far end of the dock, a small trawler bobbed in place, its hull scraped and sea-battered but functional. Ben stood beside it, checking the moorings with deliberate hands, eyes scanning the shoreline behind them. Cora was at the wheel, her knuckles white around the throttle. The flare gun she hadn't returned still resting in the holster, strapped to her hip. Riley and Remy sat near the gangway, unmoving but alert. Riley, the darker of the two, had positioned himself at the bow, his silhouette strong against the breaking morning light, his chest lifted evenly with each breath, ears twitching subtly, his focus locked on the road beyond the harbor. Remy stayed low, tail curled, one paw still bandaged from the clinic skirmish, but his posture radiated tension like a bowstring ready to snap. Cora had said very little since the incident. She had slept in 10-minute intervals, eyes darting open at every creak of wood. Ben hadn't fared better. The decoded command, annulus, still echoed in his mind. Its existence implied more than destruction. It was control at the deepest level, and whatever agency had engineered it hadn't done so carelessly. Sarah Lang had confirmed that much. When they returned to her garage lab earlier that morning, she handed over a device, a narrow, custom-built signal scrambler, the length of a flashlight, wrapped in black gaffer tape, and held together by genius and stubbornness. "This will dampen any high-frequency reactivation attempts," she said, her glasses slipping down her nose. "But it won't last long. You need to get them somewhere cold, silent, and off-grid." Ben had nodded, slipping the device into his coat. "We'll head for the islands. I know a spot." Watch your back, Sarah added, brushing crumbs from her worn Red Sox cap. They don't build dogs like this to let them walk away. They were preparing to cast off when the sound reached them, a low harmonic tone, subtle, vibrating through the dock boards like an old memory stirring in bones. Riley stiffened instantly. His ears went rigid. His muscles trembled, not from fear, but from something more primal recognition. Remy froze beside him, then growled a deep guttural sound that did not belong to a dog afraid, but to one betrayed. Ben looked toward the end of the dock. A black SUV had pulled into view, tires crunching softly over gravel. From its passenger side emerged a man in a tailored gray suit, carrying a small square device, emitting the sound. His hair was dark and neatly combed, face pale eyes hidden behind thin reflective glasses. He moved like someone used to giving orders without expecting refusal. Two others stepped out behind him, heavily built, dressed in civilian layers over body armor earpieces tucked behind close-cropped hair. No badges, no words. The man raised the device, adjusted the frequency. The tone sharpened. Riley jerked slightly, his eyes dilating. He turned not toward Ben, but toward the sound. No, Ben muttered. Riley, no. But then something remarkable happened. Riley lowered his head and turned his body sideways, stepping in front of Ben. A shield. He bared his teeth, not in confusion, but in challenge. A low growl rumbled in his throat, measured, deliberate. Behind him, Remy did the same, limping forward with his injured leg, but showing no hesitation. The man in the suit narrowed his eyes. They're responding to legacy stimuli, he said calmly. That's not rejection, that's hesitation. Cora stepped down from the boat, fury written in every line of her face. You built them to obey, and now they're choosing. You lost your leverage. The man didn't look at her. Dr. Sullivan. Still playing rebel scientist. Still tampering with what doesn't belong to you. Asset Echo 2B no longer belongs to you, she said coldly. They never did. A siren howled across the marina, sharp rising in pitch. It wasn't local, it was federal. From the other end of the harbor, two black vehicles appeared, lights flashing behind tinted windshields. The SUV's backup team moved to draw weapons, but froze when a voice barked from a loudspeaker. Drop the device and step away from the animals. You are under federal investigation for unauthorized bioengineering and operational breach of domestic peace under Title 10 statutes. The man in the suit glanced at the incoming agents, then at Riley, who now stood stone still, unmoving, unreadable. He let the device drop. It clattered against the dock and bounced once before sliding toward the edge. The federal agents moved in fast, tactical, precise. The suited man didn't resist. Neither did his men. As he was cuffed, he turned once more toward Cora. They're a liability, he said quietly. And one day you'll see why. No, she replied. They're proof we can choose something better. Riley relaxed only when the man disappeared into the back of the vehicle. Remy whimpered, then licked Riley's jaw once, a soft bonding gesture. A flicker of something passed between them. Something neither machine nor programming could script. Ben turned to the lead agent, a broad-shouldered woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked braids and an air of authority that needed no weapon to support it. She wore a black vest with the insignia of the Special Operations Oversight Task Force, a rarely seen but very real branch of U.S. internal intelligence. Her name tag read, Agent Mays. She extended a hand. Mr. Holloway, Dr. Sullivan, I'm Agent Mays. We've been monitoring the data pings from your coded distress beacons since the clinic incident. We weren't sure if we'd arrive in time. You did, Ben said. Barely. Mays looked at the dogs. Are they stable? They're more than stable, Cora said. They're deciding. Mays nodded slowly. We have legal grounds to detain and secure all bioengineered assets tied to Project Neptune Echo, especially Tier 2. Ben stepped forward. They're not assets, they're survivors. Mays considered this, her expression unreadable. I have some discretion, she said after a moment. You give me a few days, stay off radar, let things cool. You'll hear from me again. She turned and walked away without another word. As the vehicles pulled out and silence returned to the dock, Ben looked down at the dogs. They could have gone back, he said quietly, but they didn't. Cora smiled faintly. Because this time, they chose. The sun rose slow and golden over the Atlantic, stretching its light across the rippling tide like fingers reaching for warmth. The shoreline curved gently around the southern edge of Cedar Bay, where dunes met sea and a narrow wooden cabin rested on weathered stilts just above the morning foam. Its windows glowed with soft yellow light. The chimney, rarely used, smoked faintly in the spring chill. Ben Holloway stepped barefoot onto the porch, a steaming mug in one hand and a light fleece pulled over his shoulders. His beard was a little longer now, flecked with more gray, and his movements a little slower, but his eyes held a calm that hadn't been there before. It was the kind of quiet that came not from giving up, but from finally laying something down. Behind him, the front door creaked as Cora Sullivan appeared. She wore a loose linen shirt over faded denim, and her hair, once tightly bound in a bun, now hung freely to her shoulders, streaked with lighter shades from the sun. Her gait was relaxed, her posture softer, the old lines of vigilance in her face smoothed by time and a kind of earned stillness. She carried a notebook and a pencil tucked behind one ear, scribbled thoughts clinging to the edge of every page. Veterinary work had returned to her, slowly selective, intentional, more focused on healing than treating. On the sand below, two figures played in the surf, Riley and Remy. No longer lean from exhaustion or skittish from fear, they had filled out over the past 3 months into strong, gleaming young German shepherds. Riley's dark coat shimmered in the morning spray, his body taut but free in motion. Remy, a half-shade lighter, bounded after him, no longer favoring his healed leg. Their eyes were bright. Their movements, once rigid with purpose, were now filled with the uncoordinated bursts of joy only youth and safety allowed. They didn't wear their old collars anymore. Ben glanced at the new ones, handmade from tanned leather, stitched by Cora's own hand. Simple bands with just 2 words etched in gold foil beneath the surface. Free soul. Not a tag, not a serial number, but a statement, an identity, a rebirth. He stepped off the porch and walked down the sloped path to the beach. The breeze tugged at the edge of his coat, and salt clung to the air like an old memory softened by time. The dogs looked up as he approached. Riley trotted over, first pressing his head briefly into Ben's hand, then sitting quietly beside him, gaze sweeping the waves. Remy flopped beside Riley and rolled in the warm sand tongue, lolling tail, swishing. "Still keeping watch, huh?" Ben asked softly. Riley blinked, then leaned slightly against his leg. Cora joined them moments later, slipping her hand into Ben's. They stood that way for a while, watching the horizon, not looking for threats, but simply existing in the place between ocean and land where everything felt suspended. A few days earlier, they'd received a letter, hand-delivered by Agent Mays herself. The woman had arrived in her signature black vest and silver-streaked braids, but this time, with no entourage, no clipped instructions. Only a manila envelope and a worn smile. She had sat on their porch, shared coffee, and said, "Only this, consider this closure, for now." Inside the envelope was a short document confirmation that all remaining Project Neptune Echo files were officially locked under federal seal. No further recovery operations, no future retrieval attempts. Riley and Remy were legally reclassified, not assets, but living protected companions under amended legislation Cora had quietly lobbied for with help from a few old allies. "You bought them their lives," Ben had said. Cora shook her head. They earned it. In the evenings, the 4 of them would often sit by the shore as the sun dipped behind the waves. Cora would read aloud from old field journals she was rewriting, not for publishing, but for legacy, for remembering. Ben would sketch in a notebook. He rarely let others see mechanical ideas, sometimes poems. And Riley and Remy would lie with their heads on their paws, occasionally glancing at one another like soldiers who no longer needed to keep watch, but still did out of habit and love. They never asked for more. They never needed more. That afternoon, Cora took the dogs into town. The streets of Blue Haven were brighter in spring. Children darted between shops. Bicycles lined the sidewalks, and wine chimes danced above cafe windows. Linda, the local pet shop owner, greeted them with a wide grin. "You two again," she said, crouching to pat Riley. "You've become something of a legend around here." Riley sniffed her hand and gave a polite wag. Remy, more social, gave her a wet lick on the wrist. Linda chuckled and pointed to a display near the register. 2 small statues, carved wood and painted carefully, stood proudly beside a flyer titled "From Asset to Family," the story of Riley and Remy. Cora raised an eyebrow. Wasn't you?" Linda said. "Town council put it up. said we could all use a reminder that not everything built for war has to end that way. Cora smiled. When they returned to the cabin, the dogs ran down the trail toward Ben, who was setting up a small fire pit for the evening. They circled him, once, then collapsed on the porch in contented heaps, tongues out, eyes half closed. Later, when the sky bled, amber and the moon crept into view, Ben, Cora Riley, and Remy sat side by side on the sand. No words, no plans. Just a shared warmth beneath a violet sky. In the end, it wasn't the files or the decoded commands or even the government closure that mattered most. It was the choice, not to obey, not to forget, but to live. Not all miracles come with light and thunder. Sometimes they come as two dogs who refuse to give up even when the world gave up on them. Riley and Remy remind us that love can rewrite any story, and God still sends quiet miracles to guide us back home. If this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment below how their journey moved you, and if you believe in second chances and grace, type Amen. May God bless you and all the souls He sends to walk beside you.